I've always believed life could be calculated. Numbers don't lie. Investments grow or shrink depending on how much effort and strategy you put in. Yet, as I stared out at the sprawling Manhattan skyline from my penthouse, its glittering lights reflected off the glass, I realized something that made my gut twist in a way no financial loss ever had. My life, for all its success, was empty. The numbers couldn't fix that. My name is Jonathan Pierce. I'm 45, the kind of person people glance at twice, not because I'm particularly handsome, but because I wear the mark of wealth in every detail. Tailored suits, a watch worth more than some people's homes, and shoes so polished you could see your own reflection. It's all a carefully constructed facade. Beneath it, there's nothing. 2 failed marriages taught me that love, or whatever society packages as love, is just a fleeting arrangement bound by convenience and unmet expectations. The idea of trusting someone again? Out of the question. Yet, in the quiet hours of the night, when Manhattan's noise dies down to a dull hum, a persistent thought gnawed at me. What would my legacy be? I had no answer. Money could buy a lot: houses, cars, influence. But it couldn't buy time or the promise of something lasting. It couldn't fill the suffocating void that reminded me I was alone in a room full of things and no one to share them with. I didn't want companionship, though. I wanted an heir. Someone to carry my name forward. Cold? Perhaps. But I'd long since stopped caring about how others judged me. It wasn't until an unplanned drive through the city one evening that my carefully calculated life began to spiral into something I couldn't predict. It was one of those nights where nothing I did seemed to silence the restlessness in my chest. The usual distractions, fine wine, expensive meals, meaningless calls, didn't work. So, I grabbed my keys, stepped into my sleek black car, and drove. Manhattan streets were alive with their usual chaos, a blur of yellow cabs and flashing billboards. Yet, in the midst of it all, I saw her. She was sitting against a graffitied wall near 34th Street, wrapped in a worn, oversized coat that didn't match the chill of the evening. Her hair was a tangled mess, but it was her eyes that stopped me. Even from my car, I could see them, blue, piercing, and filled with something raw. It wasn't just desperation. It was defiance, a kind of stubborn will that refused to be extinguished. Without thinking, I pulled over. What was I doing? This was insane even for me. Yet, some unseen force made me lower the passenger window. "Need a ride?" I asked, my voice breaking the night's rhythm of honking horns and distant chatter. She looked at me, wary. "Why?" Fair question. I wasn't even sure of the answer myself. "I don't know," I admitted, surprising myself with the honesty. For a moment, she hesitated. Then, as if deciding she had nothing to lose, she stood and approached the car. As she slid into the seat, the faint scent of damp clothing and cold air filled the cabin. "Where to?" Her lips parted as if she were about to give an address but then stopped. "Nowhere in particular. I just needed to get off that corner." It wasn't until we were driving through the quieter streets of Soho that the idea struck me. "Do you have a name?" I asked, glancing at her. She hesitated. "Isabel," she said finally. "Isabel Lauron," she added after a pause, as if holding on to the formality gave her a shred of dignity in the face of whatever she was going through. "Well, Isabel Lauron, I have a proposition for you." Her brows knitted together in suspicion. "What kind of proposition?" I pulled the car over into a quiet parking lot and turned to face her. "Let me be clear. This isn't what you think." She folded her arms, a defense mechanism as old as time. "I haven't thought anything yet. I want you to have my child," I said bluntly. Her eyes widened, then narrowed as she scoffed. "You're joking." "I'm not," I replied, my tone flat. "Artificial insemination. No complications, no strings. I'll pay you handsomely. Enough to turn your life around." Her laughter was sharp and bitter. "Is this some kind of rich guy experiment? Find a homeless woman, throw money at her, and see what happens?" I leaned back, unbothered by her accusation. "Think what you want, but I'm serious. You need a way out and I need an heir. It's mutually beneficial." For a moment, she just stared at me. The silence stretched so long that I began to think she'd reject the offer outright. But then, something flickered in her expression. A mix of desperation and reluctant curiosity. "What's the catch?" "There is none. We'll sign a contract. Everything will be clear and legal. Once the child is born, our agreement ends. You walk away financially secure, and I get what I want." Her voice trembled when she spoke next. "And what about me? What happens to me after that?" I shrugged, careful not to reveal the cracks in my own resolve. "That's up to you." The car ride ended with Isabel agreeing to meet at my lawyer's office the next day to discuss the details. As I dropped her off near a shelter, I noticed her glance back at me just before disappearing into the crowd. That night, I expected to feel satisfaction. After all, I'd taken the first step in solving my problem. Yet, as I stood by the window of my penthouse, watching the city lights dance, I couldn't shake the strange weight pressing down on me. Something about Isabel lingered, her defiance, her vulnerability. Maybe this wasn't just about an heir. Maybe, for the first time in years, I'd let something unpredictable into my carefully controlled life. Little did I know, Isabel's decision to say yes wasn't as straightforward as I thought. And neither was her past. By the next morning, everything I thought I knew about my plan and her would begin to unravel. I arrived at the gates of Jonathan's mansion in a cab that looked painfully out of place against the pristine, tree-lined driveway. The driver shot me a sideways glance as if questioning whether someone like me belonged in a place like this. Truth be told, I didn't feel like I did. My reflection in the car window, disheveled hair, worn jacket, was a stark contrast to the manicured perfection of the estate before me. The mansion itself was a fortress of wealth, all sleek lines and cold, imposing architecture. It loomed in the distance as the cab rolled to a stop. As I stepped out, the enormity of the situation hit me again. I wasn't just entering a house. I was walking into an arrangement that would change my life forever. And, if I was honest with myself, I wasn't entirely sure I wanted it to. Jonathan met me at the door, impeccably dressed as always, his expression unreadable. If he was at all surprised by how out of place I looked against the marble floors and crystal chandeliers, he didn't show it. "This is where you'll be staying," he said, gesturing toward a sweeping staircase that seemed to spiral into infinity. I followed him silently, my footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. Everything about the mansion felt too big, too perfect, too cold. It wasn't a home. It was a monument to someone's success. "The staff has been instructed to provide anything you need," he continued, his tone detached. "But don't mistake this for anything more than what it is. A business arrangement." I nodded, feeling a lump form in my throat. I should have been relieved by his bluntness, but it stung more than I cared to admit. My room was as extravagant as the rest of the house. A four-poster bed, floor-to-ceiling windows, and a view of the city skyline. It was the kind of place most people would dream of, but it only made me feel more out of place. I unpacked what little I had. A few changes of clothes, a toothbrush, a dog-eared book. Seeing my belongings in this room felt almost laughable. As I settled in, I caught a glimpse of myself in the mirror. I looked different somehow, like the reflection of someone caught between two worlds. The Isabel from 34th Street, scrappy and guarded, seemed to fade away in the glow of luxury. The next morning, Jonathan knocked on my door, punctual as ever. "The clinic is expecting us," he said without preamble. I followed him to the sleek black car waiting outside, and we drove in silence through the city. The fertility clinic was as pristine as his mansion, with a staff that greeted him like he was royalty. I felt like a shadow next to him, a ghost trailing behind. The doctor was a woman with kind eyes and a calm voice. She explained the process in clinical terms, but her gaze kept flickering toward me, as if searching for signs of hesitation. I tried to keep my expression neutral, but my fingers clenched the armrest of my chair. "Any questions?" she asked, looking between us. Jonathan shook his head. "No, we're ready." I wasn't sure if I'd ever be ready, but I nodded anyway. Over the next few weeks, my life became a blur of appointments, tests, and paperwork. The mansion, for all its grandeur, felt like a gilded cage. I spent my days wandering its endless hallways, marveling at how much space one person could have and yet how little warmth it held. Jonathan remained distant, treating me like a component in a well-oiled machine. But every so often, I'd catch him watching me. Not with judgment, but with something else I couldn't quite place. Curiosity, maybe, or doubt. One evening, as I sat by the massive fireplace in the living room, Jonathan joined me. He rarely did, and the sight of him sitting in the chair across from me felt oddly intimate. "You seem to be adjusting," he said, his voice carefully neutral. I shrugged. "I'm still figuring it out." He nodded, his gaze fixed on the flames. For a moment, the silence between us felt less heavy, almost comfortable. "Why did you choose me?" I asked suddenly. His eyes flicked to mine, and for the first time I saw a crack in his armor. "You looked like someone who wouldn't say no." The words stung, but there was a truth in them I couldn't deny. "And why do you want a child?" I pressed. He hesitated, as if weighing whether to answer. "Because money doesn't mean anything if there's no one to leave it to." His honesty caught me off guard. Beneath his pragmatic exterior, there was a loneliness that mirrored my own. The day the insemination worked was both surreal and overwhelming. The doctor called with the results, her voice warm with congratulations. I stared at the phone, unable to process the news. A life was growing inside me. A life that wasn't just mine, but also his. Jonathan didn't say much when I told him, just nodded with a curt, "Good." Yet, I noticed the way his shoulders relaxed, the faintest trace of a smile tugging at his lips. As the weeks turned into months, I began to feel the stirrings of something I hadn't expected. Love. Not for Jonathan, but for the tiny life inside me. I found myself talking to the baby when I was alone, imagining a future for it that didn't revolve around contracts or cold bargains. Jonathan, too, began to change in small, almost imperceptible ways. He'd ask about the baby, about how I was feeling. His questions were clumsy, awkward, but they carried a sincerity I hadn't seen before. One evening, as we sat in the kitchen, yes, the kitchen, not the dining room for once, he asked, "Do you ever think about what comes after?" I looked at him, surprised. "After what?" "After the baby's born. After this agreement." His words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken implications. Before I could answer, a knock at the door interrupted us. Jonathan's expression shifted, his calm facade cracking just slightly. Whoever was at the door, it wasn't someone he'd expected. And as the door swung open, the past Jonathan had worked so hard to bury came rushing back. The day started like any other. A quick breakfast in the sprawling, silent mansion, followed by yet another doctor's appointment. By now, I'd grown used to the rhythm of pregnancy checkups, the coolness of the sterile rooms, the faint hum of machines. Jonathan always came along, sitting silently in the corner, checking emails on his phone, his expression unreadable as usual. But today wasn't like the others. The doctor, a woman with kind eyes and a reassuring tone, squinted at the ultrasound monitor longer than usual. My heart skipped a beat. Was something wrong? I glanced at Jonathan, who had finally looked up from his phone. "Is everything okay?" I asked, my voice trembling. She smiled, though there was a flicker of something in her expression. Excitement, perhaps? "Everything's fine. More than fine, actually." I gripped the edge of the examination table. "What do you mean?" She turned the monitor toward us, her finger tracing 3 small shapes on the screen. "It's triplets." For a moment, the room was silent. Jonathan sat frozen, his normally impenetrable facade cracked wide open. His mouth parted slightly as if to speak, but no words came. "Triplets," I echoed, barely able to comprehend the word. My hands instinctively moved to my belly, which suddenly felt impossibly small for the monumental task ahead. The doctor nodded. "It's rare, but it happens. You're carrying 3 healthy babies." I felt a surge of emotions, joy, fear, disbelief, all colliding at once. But when I looked at Jonathan, I saw something entirely different. His expression wasn't joyful or fearful. It was complicated. The drive home was quiet, the kind of silence that felt too big for the small space of the car. I kept sneaking glances at Jonathan, but his face was unreadable again, his hands gripping the steering wheel a little too tightly. "You don't have to act like it's the end of the world," I said, finally breaking the silence. He let out a breath, his jaw tightening. "It's not about that." "Then what is it about?" He didn't answer right away, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. "It wasn't what I planned." I laughed bitterly. "Well, welcome to my life. Nothing's gone as planned for me either." Over the next few weeks, the news of triplets rippled through our lives like a pebble dropped into a still pond. The quiet routine of the mansion was disrupted as Jonathan began making arrangements. Consultations with specialists, upgrades to the nursery plans, and an endless stream of deliveries. Cribs, diapers, bottles, everything arrived in threes. At first, his efforts seemed purely practical, the work of a man who needed everything to be controlled and accounted for. But slowly, I began to notice small changes in him. One morning, I woke to find him in the nursery, staring at the freshly painted walls. The room had been transformed into a haven of soft blues and whites, with a mural of clouds painted across the ceiling. "It's beautiful," I said softly from the doorway. He turned, startled. "It's just paint." But the way his fingers brushed over the edge of a tiny crib betrayed something deeper. As my belly grew, so did the connection between us. It wasn't love, at least not the kind you read about in stories. It was something quieter, more tentative. A shared responsibility. A mutual understanding. Jonathan started joining me for evening walks around the mansion's garden, his strides matching mine as I waddled along the stone paths. He didn't say much, but his presence was steady, grounding. "Do you ever think about what they'll be like?" I asked one evening, my hands resting on my swollen belly. He glanced at me, his expression softening. "Sometimes." And he hesitated, then looked away. "I hope they're stronger than I was." His words lingered in the air, heavy with unspoken history. I wanted to ask what he meant, but something told me to leave it alone. For now. The day the triplets arrived was a blur of chaos and wonder. Labor was long, exhausting, and unlike anything I'd ever experienced. But the moment I heard their cries, the first tiny wails of life, I felt a love so overwhelming it brought tears streaming down my face. Jonathan stood at the edge of the room, his hands clenched into fists as if he didn't trust himself to move. When the nurse handed him one of the babies, a wriggling, swaddled little girl, his expression shifted. For the first time, I saw something unguarded in his eyes. "Oh, she's so small," he whispered, his voice trembling. "They all are," I said, laughing through my tears. The three babies, 2 girls and a boy, were perfect. Fragile, tiny, and utterly dependent on us. In the days that followed, the mansion felt less like a cold, empty space and more like a home. The sound of crying filled the halls, breaking the heavy silence that once hung over everything. I spent hours rocking the babies, marveling at their tiny fingers and delicate features. Jonathan was quieter, but his actions spoke volumes. He hired a team of nannies but insisted on being involved, feeding them, changing diapers, even pacing the nursery in the middle of the night when one of them wouldn't stop crying. "You don't have to do this," I said one night as I found him rocking the boy, his expression uncharacteristically soft. "I know," he replied simply, but the shadow of the contract loomed over me like a storm cloud. Every moment I spent with the babies made the thought of leaving them unbearable. I'd agreed to walk away, to let Jonathan raise them as his own. But how could I? One evening, as I watched Jonathan place the boy in his crib, I couldn't hold it in any longer. "I can't leave them," I whispered, my voice breaking. He turned to me, his face unreadable. "You knew the terms. They're not just terms. They're my children." For a moment, his jaw tightened, and I thought he'd brush me off. But then, to my surprise, he sighed. "I don't know what to do either," he admitted. Before either of us could say more, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hall. A voice called out, a woman's voice. "Jonathan, we need to talk." I turned, my heart sinking as a figure appeared in the doorway, her face pale but determined. Whoever she was, her presence threatened to unravel everything we'd built so far. The days after the triplets' birth were a whirlwind of sleepless nights, feedings, and fleeting moments of wonder. The mansion, once cold and silent, now brimmed with life. Their cries echoed through the halls, and the soft coos and laughter of the babies filled every corner. But beneath the joy, a storm brewed inside me. The contract was clear. When the time came, I would have to leave. I didn't know how I would do it. Every time I looked into their tiny faces, I felt my resolve cracking. Jonathan, for all his stoicism, had taken to fatherhood in a way I hadn't expected. I watched him late at night as he paced the nursery, cradling one of the girls against his chest. He wasn't the man I'd met months ago, cold and detached. He was softer now, though he would never admit it. But his kindness only made it harder. As much as I had grown to care for him, I knew better than to believe this arrangement could turn into something real. He'd said it himself from the start. This was just a transaction. The breaking point came one afternoon as I sat in the nursery, holding all three of them close. The enormity of what I was about to lose hit me like a tidal wave. My tears fell silently, but I didn't notice Jonathan standing in the doorway until he cleared his throat. "You're crying," he said, his voice softer than I'd expected. I wiped my face hastily. "It's nothing. It doesn't look like nothing," he pressed, stepping into the room. "It's complicated," I admitted, my voice trembling. "The day's coming, Jonathan. The day I have to leave." He stiffened, his hands clenching at his sides. "You knew this was the deal." "I know," I snapped, unable to keep the anger out of my voice. "But that doesn't make it any easier. They're my children, Jonathan. They're ours." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken truths. Jonathan didn't respond, but his jaw tightened, and he turned abruptly, leaving the room. That evening I began packing. My room, once filled with the few belongings I had, now felt emptier than ever. Each folded piece of clothing felt like a goodbye I wasn't ready to say. A knock at the door startled me. I expected it to be one of the staff, but it was Jonathan. His eyes swept over the suitcase on the bed, his expression darkening. "You're leaving already?" I hesitated. "I thought it might be easier if I got a head start." His gaze narrowed. "Or maybe you're running away with Mark." "Mark?" I blinked, confused. "What are you talking about?" "Don't play dumb," he snapped, stepping further into the room. "I've seen the way he looks at you, the way you smile at him. Are you planning to leave with him? Take my children and start a new life together?" His words stung, not because they were true, but because they revealed a jealousy I hadn't expected. "Mark is just a friend," I said firmly, my voice shaking with frustration. "You think I want to leave? You think I haven't been tearing myself apart over this?" He froze, the anger in his eyes dimming as something else, something raw, took its place. "I can't do this," he said suddenly, his voice cracking. "Do what?" I asked, my heart pounding. "This," he said, gesturing to the suitcase, to me, to the space between us. "Let you go. Pretend like this was just a business deal. Because it wasn't." I stared at him, my breath catching. "You're more than their mother, Isabel. You're more to me than I ever thought you would be," he admitted, his words rushed and desperate. "I thought I could keep my distance, keep this transaction clean, but I can't. Not anymore." Before I could respond, he pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket and tore it in half, then in quarters. "The contract. You're tearing up the contract?" I whispered, hardly believing what I was seeing. "I'm asking you to stay," he said, his voice quieter now, trembling with vulnerability. "Not for them, though God knows they need you. Not for this arrangement. For me. Because I need you." The room fell silent except for the sound of my heart pounding in my ears. "I love you, Isabel," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "And I know I've done nothing to deserve your love in return, but I had to say it. I can't lose you. Not like this." Tears spilled down my cheeks, and I took a shaky step forward. "You idiot," I said, my voice breaking. "You've had my love this whole time, even when you were cold, even when you tried to keep me at arm's length. I loved you anyway." We stood there, the weight of everything unspoken finally lifted. And then, for the first time, Jonathan reached for me. Not out of obligation, not out of need, but out of love. His hands cupped my face as he pulled me into a kiss that was tender and desperate all at once. When we pulled apart, his forehead rested against mine, and I felt the faintest tremble in his shoulders. "What do we do now?" I asked softly. "We rewrite it," he said simply. "Our lives, our story. Together." Just as it seemed like everything had fallen into place, a phone call shattered the fragile peace we'd found. The voice on the other end brought news neither of us expected. A challenge to the custody of the triplets that would threaten the very foundation of our new beginning. The mansion felt different now. Where there had once been echoes of solitude, there were now the sounds of life. Tiny feet padding across the hardwood floors, the soft hum of lullabies from the nursery, and, most surprising of all, laughter. It wasn't just the babies. It was us, Jonathan and me. The walls that once seemed to trap him in his loneliness now felt alive with love and possibility. Jonathan had changed. Or maybe he hadn't changed so much as revealed parts of himself he'd kept hidden. He wasn't perfect, but the man who once shied away from connection now leaned into it. I saw it in the way he scooped up the triplets after a long day, letting them crawl all over him as they gurgled and cooed in delight. "I never thought I'd be this kind of man," he admitted one evening as we stood by the crib, watching the babies sleep. "What kind of man?" I asked, taking his hand. "The kind who cares," he said, his voice tinged with awe and disbelief. Our days became a delicate dance, balancing the chaos of raising 3 babies with the quiet moments that made it all worthwhile. Jonathan, once a man who delegated everything, now insisted on being involved. He was there for every milestone, the first giggles, the first time they sat up, and the endless stream of firsts that filled our lives with wonder. One evening, as I sat in the living room sorting through baby clothes, Jonathan appeared with a tray of tea and biscuits. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes. "You're spoiling me?" I teased, smiling up at him. "You deserve it," he replied, sitting beside me. His hand brushed mine as he reached for a biscuit, and I felt the now familiar warmth of his presence. The triplets had their own personalities, even at such a young age. Emma, the oldest by minutes, was determined and stubborn, always the first to try something new. Grace, the quieter one, watched the world with wide, curious eyes. And Leo, our little mischief maker, had a laugh that could brighten the darkest day. "They're going to drive us crazy one day," Jonathan said with a chuckle as Leo tried to climb out of his crib for the 3rd time that night. "And we'll love every second of it," I replied, leaning against him. As our family grew closer, so did Jonathan and I. He started opening up about his past. The failures, the heartbreaks, the deep-seated fear that he wasn't capable of love. "You're wrong, you know," I said one night as we lay in bed, the babies finally asleep in their nursery. "About what?" "About not being capable of love. You love them. And you love me," I said, my voice steady. His hand found mine under the covers. "I do," he admitted. "I just never thought I'd be good at it." "You're better than you think," I whispered, squeezing his hand. One evening, after the triplets had gone to sleep, Jonathan led me out to the garden. It was a warm night, the stars shining brightly overhead. I could tell he was nervous, his usual composure giving way to a vulnerability that made my heart ache. "I've been thinking," he began, clearing his throat, "about us, about everything we've built together." I tilted my head, watching him carefully. "And," he took a deep breath and dropped to one knee, pulling a small velvet box from his pocket. "I never thought I'd find this. Someone who makes me better, who makes me want to be better. Isabel, will you marry me?" For a moment, I was too stunned to speak. The man who had once seen me as nothing more than a means to an end was now looking up at me with hope and love in his eyes. "Yes," I whispered, tears streaming down my face. Yes, of course, I'll marry you. The wedding was a small, intimate affair held in the garden of the mansion. The triplets, dressed in tiny matching outfits, were the stars of the day, their laughter echoing through the ceremony. As I walked down the aisle, my heart swelled with gratitude and joy. Jonathan stood at the end, his eyes fixed on me with a look that made me feel like the most loved person in the world. When we exchanged vows, his voice was steady but filled with emotion. "You've given me more than I ever thought possible," he said. "You've shown me what it means to truly live and love. I promise to spend the rest of my life making you and our family as happy as you've made me." The reception was filled with laughter, music, and the warmth of family and friends. Mark, who had remained a steadfast friend despite the awkwardness of the past, raised a toast to our resilience and the family we'd built. "To Jonathan and Isabel," he said, raising his glass. "Proof that sometimes the most unexpected beginnings lead to the happiest endings." As the evening wound down, Jonathan and I stole a quiet moment together under the stars. "We did it," I said, resting my head on his shoulder. "We did," he replied, wrapping an arm around me. The mansion, once a symbol of isolation, was now a home, a place filled with love, laughter, and the promise of a brighter future. Together, we'd built something beautiful, something lasting. And for the first time, I truly believed that happiness wasn't just a fleeting moment. It was a choice, a journey we'd chosen to take together. As the days turned into weeks, a letter arrived. A piece of Jonathan's past he thought he'd left behind. Its contents threatened to unravel everything they'd worked so hard to build. Their love and newfound family would face the ultimate test. The triplets were a whirlwind. Emma, Grace, and Leo seemed to grow before our eyes, their milestones marking the passage of time with more clarity than the calendar ever could. Their laughter was the soundtrack of our days, and their tiny victories, rolling over, crawling, babbling their first words, filled our hearts with pride. Jonathan had transformed in ways I hadn't thought possible. The man who once saw children as heirs to a legacy now approached fatherhood with a devotion that surprised even himself. He spent hours reading bedtime stories, his deep voice softening as he brought the characters to life. He cheered for every milestone as if they'd just won the Super Bowl, and his office now boasted not just sleek modern furniture but also finger paintings and photos of our growing family. One night, as I tucked the triplets into their cribs, Jonathan stood behind me, leaning against the doorframe. His eyes, once so guarded, were warm as he watched me gently brush Emma's hair from her face. "Never thought I'd find this," he said softly. I turned to him, tilting my head. "Find what?" "Peace," he said, stepping into the room. "And love. Both, I guess." His words wrapped around me like a blanket. I reached for his hand, squeezing it lightly. "You didn't find it, Jonathan," I said. "You built it." Our days were far from perfect, but they were ours. The mansion, which had once been a hollow monument to wealth, was now a home in every sense of the word. The once silent halls were alive with squeals of laughter, the pitter-patter of tiny feet, and the occasional cry that sent us rushing to soothe whichever triplet had woken. There were challenges, of course. Teething, sleepless nights, and the chaos of managing 3 energetic toddlers. But every struggle was softened by the knowledge that we were facing them together. Jonathan and I found a rhythm that worked for us. He handled the practicalities with his characteristic precision, ensuring the triplets had everything they needed, and then some. Meanwhile, I brought the warmth, the heart, the connection that turned our house into a sanctuary. One morning, as the triplets sat in their high chairs, gleefully smearing oatmeal across their faces, Jonathan turned to me with a bemused expression. "Did you ever think this is where we'd end up?" he asked, gesturing to the chaos. I laughed, wiping Leo's sticky face. "Not in a million years. But I wouldn't trade it for anything." "Neither would I," he said, his voice softer now. Our eyes met, and for a moment, the noise around us faded. In that shared glance, we both knew how far we'd come, and how much further we'd go together. The triplets were our world, but they weren't the only thing holding us together. Jonathan and I had grown into a partnership defined not by necessity, but by love. He'd become more open, more willing to share the pieces of himself he once kept hidden. And I'd learned to trust again, to believe that I was worthy of the happiness we'd built. One evening, after the triplets had gone to bed, we sat on the balcony overlooking the city. The stars sparkled above us, and the lights of Manhattan stretched out below. "I never asked you this," Jonathan said, breaking the comfortable silence. "But do you miss your old life?" I thought for a moment, letting his question settle. "No," I said finally. "I miss parts of who I was. The girl who dreamed of a better life, who believed in second chances. But I don't miss being lost." He nodded, his hand finding mine. "You're not lost anymore." "Neither are you," I said, smiling at him. Life wasn't always easy, but the challenges we faced only brought us closer. Jonathan's business demanded much of his time, but he made a point to prioritize us. He no longer hid behind his work or his wealth. He let himself be vulnerable, be human. And I, once a homeless wanderer with nothing but a dream, had found a purpose I never imagined. Motherhood wasn't just a role. It was a gift, one that reshaped me into someone stronger, braver, and more compassionate than I thought possible. One afternoon, as I played with the triplets in the garden, Jonathan joined us, a rare free moment in his busy schedule. He watched as Leo toddled toward him, his little arms outstretched. "You've got this, buddy," Jonathan said, crouching down to catch him. Leo stumbled, giggling, into his father's arms, and the sight made my heart swell. "You're a natural," I said, watching them. Jonathan looked up, a proud smile on his face. "I have you to thank for that." "No," I said, shaking my head. "This is all you." As the years passed, we continued to build a life that reflected the love we'd found in each other. The triplets grew, their laughter filling the mansion with joy. Jonathan and I supported each other through every challenge, every triumph, every moment that tested our bond. Our love wasn't perfect, but it was real. It was a love born from unexpected beginnings, nurtured by shared experiences, and strengthened by the promise of a brighter future. Jonathan, once consumed by loneliness and driven by ambition, had found the deeper meaning he longed for in the family we'd created. And I, once lost and adrift, had discovered a home and a future worth cherishing. But just as we thought we'd finally found our happily ever after, life threw us another curveball. A revelation from Jonathan's past that threatened to upend everything we'd built. Could our love withstand the weight of secrets that refused to stay buried? The sun streamed through the wide windows of the mansion, illuminating the walls that once felt so imposing. Now, they were adorned with framed memories, crayon drawings, family photos, and snapshots of the life we'd built together. I sat in my favorite chair by the fireplace, a steaming mug of coffee in my hands, watching as Isabel moved through the room with the easy grace that came with years of love and comfort. The triplets were outside, their laughter ringing through the open garden as they played. At 15, they were full of life and personality, each of them a mirror reflecting different parts of us. Emma, determined and bold, was the natural leader, always ready to take on the world. Grace, quiet and introspective, found beauty in the details others overlooked. And Leo, our mischievous charmer, had a knack for turning even the most mundane moment into something extraordinary. I smiled, leaning back as the sound of their laughter reached me. This was everything I'd ever wanted, and so much more than I thought I deserved. As the years passed, I often found myself reflecting on the path that had brought me here. There was a time when I measured success by numbers on a balance sheet, by the towering height of my achievements. But sitting here, surrounded by the life we'd created, I understood that those things were meaningless compared to this. Isabel stepped beside me, her hand resting on my shoulder. "They're growing up too fast," she said, her voice tinged with the bittersweet realization every parent comes to eventually. "Tell me about it," I said, reaching up to take her hand in mine. "Feels like yesterday they were learning to walk. And now Emma's talking about starting her own business," Isabel said with a laugh. "Where does the time go?" I chuckled, shaking my head. Apparently, it goes into raising 3 remarkable human beings. Her gaze softened as she looked at me. You've done more than that, Jonathan. You've given them a family, a home, a life filled with love. And I couldn't have done it without you, I said, pulling her hand to my lips. The mansion, once a cold monument to my success, had transformed into a living, breathing home. Its rooms were filled with memories, birthday parties, late-night study sessions, and quiet evenings spent together. The kitchen was Isabel's domain, a space that smelled of freshly baked cookies and homemade dinners. The library, once a place I used to escape, had become a sanctuary for our family, where stories were read, shared, and created. Every corner of this house now held a piece of us. One evening, as the triplets settled into the living room for a family movie night, I couldn't help but marvel at how far we'd come. Isabel sat beside me on the couch, her head resting against my shoulder, as Leo regaled us with tales of his latest misadventures at school. Emma rolled her eyes good-naturedly, while Grace quietly laughed at his antics. Watching them, I felt a swell of pride that nearly brought tears to my eyes. I hope they know how much we love them, I said softly, my voice barely above a whisper. They do, Isabel replied, her hand finding mine, because we show them every day. As the years rolled by, Isabel and I grew older, but our love only deepened. The challenges we'd faced, those first uncertain days, the trials of parenthood, the moments of doubt, had forged a bond that nothing could break. We taught our children the values that had brought us together: compassion, resilience, and the importance of family. And as they grew into young adults, we watched with pride as they carried those lessons into the world. Emma launched her own business, a venture that combined her drive with a passion for helping others. Grace pursued art, her quiet soul finding expression in colors and shapes that captured the beauty of life. And Leo, ever the charmer, used his knack for connection to bring people together in ways that left us both amazed. One evening, as Isabel and I sat in the garden, the stars twinkling above us, she reached for my hand. "Do you ever think about how it all started?" she asked, her voice soft and full of wonder. "Every day," I admitted. "I think about that night I saw you on the street, how close I came to missing you." Her smile was warm, her eyes filled with the love we'd nurtured over the years. "I think fate has a funny way of working, don't you?" "Funny, maybe," I said with a chuckle, "but also perfect." We sat there in silence, the weight of our journey settling comfortably between us. In our final years, as the triplets built lives of their own, the house grew quieter. But it was a peaceful quiet, filled with the echoes of memories that had shaped our lives. Isabel and I spent our days tending to the garden, reading together by the fire, and reminiscing about the path that had brought us to this place of love and fulfillment. "I never thought I'd have this," I said one evening as we watched the sunset from the balcony. "What's that?" Isabel asked, her head resting on my shoulder. "A legacy," I said, "not one built on wealth or success, but on love, on family." She smiled, her hand finding mine. "It's the only kind of legacy that matters." As we grew old together, our bond remained unshaken. Isabel, the woman who had turned my life upside down and filled it with meaning, was my anchor, my soulmate, my everything. And as I looked at her, even in our twilight years, I knew one thing for certain. We had found what truly mattered.